Welcome to part 2 of this beginner's tutorial for MagicaCSG. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, go back and start with that. It'll show you how to get started with this free 3D program. In part 1 we covered how to add shapes into your scene and how to arrange them into the object that you want. In this second part we will see how to stamp shapes onto your object and how to get a great looking render. So we'll just pick up where part 1 ended, and here's what our object looked like, the Android mascot. So the first step is that we're going to save as, so that we keep a copy of our file just like this if we want to come back to it. You save as by coming to this button right here, right next to the save button. For this next render, we want our mascot to look like a small plastic figurine. So we're going to link the floating arms and head so that the model looks more realistic. So let's switch to front view. We click down here on the viewport gizmo, and we're going to click on the body. And we shift drag to duplicate it up. We set the name to neck. We switch the scale mode to XYZ, or we press 3 on the keyboard. And now we're going to set the color to white, just like the eyes. A very easy way to do that is to have your stroke selected and then to alt-click on the white stroke. And now my neck is white. And now let's do the same thing for the arms. I'm going to select my arm. I'm going to Control C and Control V. This will create a copy in place. Right click, rename to shoulder. I'm going to come right here to rotate. I'm going to rotate on the Y axis, the green axis, by 90. So I just click the arrow here, scale it down, move it with the corner handle, and then we alt click on the eyes to set it to white. And there we go. Now our model looks a little more realistic, and I think here's a good place to save as again before we start coloring it and messing with it. I'm going to save here, and then I'm going to save as. There we go. Now we can start recoloring our mascot. And the image I'm using as a reference is this one here. These are a few fun designs for Android mascots, and we're going to be doing the one down here on the right, the black one with green hexagons stamped onto it. So step 1 is recoloring it. In the reference, the parts that are in green here are a very dark gray, and the parts that are in white are a kind of neon green. So first let's recolor the green parts. I'm going to select any green part, let's say the arm, and then I press this button here next to the color picker, or C on my keyboard. And what this does, if you look in the stroke list here, it selects all strokes in the same layer that have the same color. And this is an easy way to select all similarly colored strokes, and then you open the color picker and you change the color together. So now I'm recoloring all of the strokes. Now I know the hex code for the color I want, so I'm going to open the values panel here, and I'm going to set the color 2E, 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 enter. And that's our dark gray. Next I'm going to select a white stroke. Same thing, I'm going to press C on my keyboard. It selects all of the white strokes. And I'm going to set my color to 67EA4D, enter. And that's our bright neon green. So now that's our mascot recolored. Now that our mascot is recolored, we're going to stamp some shapes onto it. Let's come here to our stroke panel. We're going to add a new stroke. First, we're going to remove the mirror attribute because we don't want to mirror our new stroke. We're going to pick the regular polygon stroke type. We're going to choose 6 sides, so a hexagon. The color is already set to the green that we want. And let's decrease the round to the default 10. And let's add our stroke. And now I'm going to use one of the modes. We already saw what subtract does. If I choose subtract, it punches a hole into my body cylinder, and the hole is colored with the color of my my hexagon. But what we want here is a replace operation. So if I click replace, here's what happens. Basically we're stamping the silhouette or the intersection of our new shape onto our old shape. Okay, let's rotate it a little. Let's shove it in, set it back to replace, and you can see how the effect goes. So that's how the replace operation works. And if you look over here at the stroke list, it's called rep. So let's just call it hexagon, and it's now called hexagon rep for replace. And just like the subtract stroke, a replace stroke affects all strokes that are above it. So this will not only affect the body cylinder, it will also affect the arms if I move it. And let's set it to replace. And see, this is basically the effect that we get. Alright, so yeah, and this is how you stamp objects onto other objects, and you can do all kinds of fun effects with that. Now if you've noticed, when we rotate and we move it around, it gets stretched, and that's normal because our hexagon and our cylinder are not aligned properly. So all of this area is gonna show up as a stamp, and the way we can deal with that is that we can just center them both together. For my hexagon, I'm just gonna set the X and the Y position to 0. And so now if I set to replace, it's a nice clean hexagonal shape, and no matter how I rotate it, it'll stay a nice hexagonal shape because they have the same rotational center. So that's the trick we're going to be using here. So we'll just position it at the height that we want, and I would suggest that we shorten it a little, make it visible, x2, scale it down so that it doesn't intersect with the arms. Back to replace. In fact, we don't want it around the back, so let's shorten it even more. But if we shorten it, it won't have the same center anymore. So for now, let's keep it long, and then at the end, once we make the pattern that we want, we can shorten the strokes one by one. So let's rotate it, and now we're going to start duplicating it and moving it around and resizing it to create like a nice pattern of hexagons. And that's our new model done. As you can see, now we have a bunch of hexagons in replace mode. And as we said, now it's time to shorten them so that they don't show up on the back. Let's switch to X1 mode, and let's start shoving them, scaling them in so that they don't show. Okay, they're all gone from the back. They're still visible on the front. Now all that's left is to render our new Android Mascot. But first I want to show you something about the camera. So far we've been working in orthogonal mode. If you look down here, you have a few different modes: perspective, freestyle, orthogonal, and isometric. Most of the time you'll be working either in orthogonal or perspective. And what is the difference between the two? In orthogonal mode, as you can see, there is no perspective. Vertical lines are all vertical. Maybe you can't see what I'm talking about, but you'll notice the difference once I switch to perspective. And look at the difference. Now there are vanishing points. Now you can tell everything is pointing off into the distance. Even the view cube down here changes the way it looks. If we switch back to orthogonal, all the angles are the same. All the lines are parallel or perpendicular. But in perspective, there is a sense of perspective, if you will. So it's most visible if we switch to orthogonal and we go to front view. In front view, in orthogonal is a perfect square. But if we switch to perspective, you can see that everything is vanishing off into the back, into the distance. So that is the difference between the two camera modes. When you're working on your model, most of the time it's easier to work in orthogonal view because you don't have to worry about how things look in perspective. You can just trust that this is upright and this is upright because they look upright. In perspective, things may look misleading. Like this might look like it's rotated to the left, but you can't tell for sure because of the way the camera is angled. But other than that, it's up to you which camera mode you prefer. You may want to render your scene in perspective, you may want to really zoom in close on your model, or you may prefer it in orthogonal, where everything looks kind of flatter. So that's up to you, but I just wanted to show you the difference between the two. And now we're gonna go to render mode. So click render up here or press F2 on your keyboard, and here we are in render mode. First of all, let's change the resolution. We're gonna make a nice HD wallpaper, so 1920 by 1080. Oh, and by the way, if you just type one number, say 800, it sets it as a square, 800 by 800. Anyway, 1920, 1080. And next to the resolution, we have the sample per pixel. And this is usually a multiple of 128. So 128, 256, 512, double that. Let's set it to 1024, just so we get a higher quality render. Now in part 1 we discussed how we can turn on the ground down here, and up here in the light panel we can adjust the sun's angle, the vertical angle and the horizontal angle. But what I want to focus on in this part of the tutorial is an easy and very interesting lighting solution that gives you great results, which is HDRIs. And the way we activate that is over here in the sky section of our light panel. We switch from uniform lighting to image-based lighting. As soon as you click that, let's switch to perspective and let's remove the background color down here. And now you'll notice that we have an image in the background, and that the image is setting the lighting for the scene. Not the sun's direction, that is still set by the parameters here, but it's setting the light's color and the properties of the lighting. And in fact, we can change the image here if we click on the thumbnail. MagicaCSG comes preloaded with some images. So let's switch to this. Now you'll notice more difference in the lighting compared to if we switch back to uniform lighting here. Notice the colors on the Mascot are much flatter and duller. But if we switch back to our HDRI, it looks like it belongs in the scene. And HDRIs are images that are saved with a lot of lighting information. HDRIs let you replicate a real-world location's lighting. And there are plenty of websites where you can download HDRIs for free. You may want to, for example, download an HDRI that was taken in a brightly lit room, and that will give you a brightly lit effect on your scene. Another thing, in MagicaCSG, if you set your camera to perspective, it will display the actual image in the background once you turn off the background plate. But if you switch to orthogonal, it will just display like an inferred background color. Look, when we rotate our scene, it will change the background color. So in perspective, you actually get to see the background image. If you want to turn off the background image but still get its effects, you can just turn on the background color plate. And then over here in the display settings, you can change the background color to whatever you want. So this way you can set your own background color, but you can still get the lighting effect from the background image. Let me set the ground to a nice orange. And I'm gonna turn off the background because I do want to see my background image. We will come back to the topic of HDRIs, but for now let's move on to the material properties of our scene. So over here on the right in the matter panel, you have a couple options for the material. You've got diffuse, which is the default value. This is a basic look with soft shadows and reflections. And the second option is metal. So let's switch over to metal and see what happens. And you'll notice an instant difference in the way your object looks. This is especially noticeable when you have an HDRI background, which is why I recommend you always use HDRI. In fact, let's go back over here to our light panel, and down here over the HDRI thumbnail you have the rotation value. Let's play around with the rotation value and see what happens. So as you can see, as I rotate the background, you can see the reflection also rotating and the lighting rotating on your object. So this is why, in my opinion, the combination of HDRI background with metallic material properties is the combo that makes your MagicaCSG renders look this good. Now, of course, in our case, our object is not metallic, we want it to be a plastic figurine. But the thing is, in MagicaCSG, it's almost always a better idea to set your object to metal, even if it's not made of metal. And instead, what you play with are the values down here, especially roughness and metallic. So for example, if I want a shiny metal look, I would turn up metallic, let's say to 70, and I would set my roughness to a low value, for example 6. And this gives us a shiny metallic look to our object. As you can see, if I zoom in down here, for example on the neck and the shoulder, you can see that it looks really quite metallic. If we instead want a sort of glossy plastic look, we would instead turn up the roughness a little bit and turn down the metallic a little bit. So for example, roughness at 25, metallic at 9. And this gives us a much less reflective plastic look, but still a glossy kind of plastic. And if we want a soft plastic look, we would turn up roughness, for example 80, and we would set metallic at around 3. Let me just turn down the samples back to 512 just for a faster render, because the higher you set your samples, the slower your render is. So as you can see now, we have a nice soft looking plastic. Look at the difference between this and diffuse. In diffused you lose so much lighting information, you lose so much detail on your object. It's just much duller. So let me switch back to metal. So yeah, this is why I always set an HDRI in my renders, and I always set my material to metal, and then I play around with roughness and metallic. Let's turn it back to a glossy plastic look. So roughness around 25 and metallic at around 9. There we have our glossy plastic figurine look. And now that I have a metal property set, let me show you a little more about HDRIs. I have a few HDRIs downloaded off the internet. I recommend you check out the website polyhaven.com. I will link it in the description. But you can download a lot of different HDRIs off of there for free. And so let me switch to my HDRI folder and let me show you a few different looks. For example, here's an HDRI image that's taken at dawn. Let me turn on the background plate. You can still see the dawn colors, the purple and the orange. Like the entire lighting changes. HDRIs are really powerful in that way. Let me show you a few different HDRIs. For example, I've got this one. For example, I have a few studio HDRIs with different lighting setups. These are much harsher. They're more like for product images and stuff. And again, I can rotate it and you'll see the background rotating and the reflections on your object. Another example, this one is taken indoors. And immediately you see the difference in lighting. Anyway, I think you get the point. So yeah, play around, find an HDRI that you like, find a material property setting that you like. And next I'm going to show you how to render your image. So we're going to switch back the samples to 1024. And one more thing I recommend that you do is come over here to the camera panel, go down to bloom and set bloom to play. And down here you'll see another progress bar starting to fill out simultaneously with your render bar. And what bloom does is it adds even more lighting detail, and it kind of softens the lighting and adds more highlights and reflections that are difficult to notice, but when you switch it off you notice the difference. It just adds a higher quality to your render. So let's say this is the image I want, but let's say I still wanna let's say I notice that I still want to correct something in my model, but I think to myself, oh, I'm gonna lose this nice angle that I set here. Well, fear not, there's a way to save your camera angle in MagicaCSG. What you do is you press the number 7 on your keyboard. So now I pressed the number 7 and it saved my camera angle. And it even saves what kind of camera you're using. So I'm using perspective here, it saves that. So let's say I switch back to orthogonal. Let's say I change the angle. If I want to go back to the one I saved, I press the number 8 on my keyboard. And it recalls the camera angle and the camera setting. Number 7 to save your position, number 8 to recall it. So now if I go back to my model and I change my camera angle and I make some changes, whatever, let me undo that. In fact, even here, if I press 8, it recalls the same angle, which is useful. Anyway, so I make changes and everything, then I go back to render and I press 8 and it recalls the angle that I set. So that's pretty useful. Now you should keep in mind that when you save your file and you exit, all of these render settings are not saved currently in MagicaCSG. So your camera angle, your material properties, your light properties, your HDRI, all of these are not saved. You have to, when you reopen your file, you have to set all of these again, which is kind of frustrating, but there is at least a way to save them separately. If you come up here to show I/O, and now you have a material setting, you can import your material settings from a file, or you can export. So if I click export, I can set it as a text file, and then later on when I reopen my scene, I can import that text file. Same thing for the render settings. I can export them, and then when I reopen my scene, I can re-import them, and same thing for the camera. It's kind of frustrating, but I guess the developer figured that this would be the more useful way to do it. I don't know, maybe later on they will be saved with the file, but for now this is the way to do it. Okay, so our render is done, our bloom is done. I'm ready to save this image. So the way you do that is you come down here to the camera icon. Well, there's a few different ways. You can come over here to the image settings. You can set whatever size you want, and then you can tell it to render. But me personally, I like to just wait for the render to complete, and then I save whatever I'm seeing here, and after I set the resolution up there. So you tap the camera button, or you press 6 on your keyboard, and you save your image. There, now it's saved, and here's the image. And that's our image. And that's a really nice looking render for such a small and free program. And this brings us to the end of this two-part tutorial for complete beginners to MagicaCSG and to 3D. I hope this tutorial has been helpful to you, especially if you're new to 3D. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comment. And I've definitely got more tutorials coming on MagicaCSG. I'll be going into different techniques, more advanced stuff, because you can do some pretty great things with this program. So I hope you look forward to that. And if you want to be notified of future tutorials, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications. Thanks a lot for watching.